Welcome to the esynergy podcast. Conversations that cut through the hype and get to what works. I'm Neil McIvor. I'm the head of data for public services. And in each episode, we sit down with leaders to hear their unfiltered story. The lessons hidden in both the successes and the failures, and the practical steps that turn big ideas into real impact. Today, I'm joined by Simon McLellan, Head of Data Engagement at the UK Met Office. Now, that's the weather people, not the police force. We'll be exploring data uncertainty and data sharing and dig into the real-world decisions, struggles and breakthroughs that shaped their journey. This isn't just about data. It's not just about technology, and it's not just about trends. It's about the people behind them, the choices they make, and the insights that you can take into your own work. So let's dive in. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much.
Head of Data Engagement. That's a bit of a grand title, isn't it? So what does that actually mean in practice? What is it you actually do? But more importantly, what is it the boss thinks you do?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Yeah, that's a great question to start with. Thanks for inviting me along today. It's really good to be here. So what do I do at the Met Office? Well, as the Head of Data Engagement, I work with our Chief Data and Information Officer. I sort of represent him at quite a few events with stakeholders in UK government particularly, and internationally, engaging with those bodies and with those organisations to engage, consult, advise, and maybe even influence all manner of aspects of data policy, data management. Data sharing particularly is a big thing for us at the Met Office.
So it sounds like a really interesting place to work then. So a lot of people just know the Met Office for the weather forecast and on the app, should we hang out washing out or put on the big coat and all the rest of it. But what else does the Met Office do?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. We have perhaps 2,000 staff. We're based down in Exeter, in Devon. And the key thing that we do, the vision of the Met Office that really the purpose of the Met Office actually is helping you, whoever you are, make better decisions to stay safe and thrive. And everything that we do is built around that premise. And it's really what engages staff across the organisation to do that. And you could be an individual, whether to put the big coat on or whether to put the fire on, or it could be, governments. It could be people doing strategic planning. It could be anything in between. Our community of users range from citizens, as we talked about, but also governments. Different parts of government are impacted by the weather. We work with energy companies, we work with transport companies. Ministry of Defence are a big customer of ours. At one point, the Met Office was a part of the MOD. We're now in DSIT, Departments of Science, Innovation and Technology. And of course, internationally as well. We have a really significant role to play in the sort of international communities around environmental science, weather and climate. So yeah, it's more than just will I need to catch a bus and will I need a brolly this afternoon?
And I presume you're based down next to because the weather's better down there.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. It's a nice place. We were, till about 20 odd years ago, we were just outside London. We were in Reading in the Thames Valley, and as part of the sort of expanding the civil service out beyond, the southeast of England, it was the Met Office took an opportunity to have a purpose-built building down in just outside Exeter, and it's been a great move for us actually.
Excellent, lovely. And I expect there's a huge amount of uncertainty, isn't there, in predicting what the weather does as well. So I'm used to looking at the app and it says 50% chance of rain. And I suspect most people will assume that means it rains, but 50% chance means it's just as likely to rain as not.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, often, one of the things I hear a lot of people talk about is data equals fact. Data is something that's been measured, it's been recorded. You have a measure of that, so your address, your age, there's lots of things that are factual. And we do measure the weather, we measure what the temperatures and the wind speed is all around the world, because, the weather flows around the world. So weather data needs to flow around the world. And so we do gather data from around the world to help us forecast the weather in the UK. But when we do forecast the weather, that is a prediction into the future. And we treat our forecasts, our predictions, as data, even though they've not actually happened yet. So there is that sort of uncertainty in that. And the further into the future that we're predicting, whether we're talking about what the weather will be like at the weekend or what it'll be like in the next a couple of months, maybe, as we look at help to strategic planners, but also as we look at climate change and predictions of sea level rise and temperature with different scenarios out to the end of the century. So those uncertainties grow necessarily the further into the future we're predicting. And the challenge that we've got is looking at how we work with people that are making decisions based on this forecast. So actually, it depends when you need to make a decision. When's the most accurate forecast for this event that I want to do on Saturday afternoon? Well, probably Saturday morning. But if you need to make a decision as to whether to cancel or whether to bring in more staff or whatever it is, some contingency, if you need to make that decision maybe on Friday, well, then use the forecast on Friday. And you'll quite often hear the presenters saying, there's perhaps some uncertainty in the future in the forecast, or keep tuned for the latest information on this. And our weather warnings are a really great example of that, where we are now starting to issue broad weather warnings just to raise awareness several days in advance of something, perhaps where the storm hasn't even developed in the middle of the Atlantic, and we can see that the physics of the atmosphere looks like a storm is brewing, so to speak. And as closer to the event we get, we can update those warnings both in terms of the impact, but also in terms of the location and the timing. So there's multiple dimensions of our forecasting of the impact of weather, but we do get greater and greater accuracy the closer to the time of the event that we are. But it depends on when you need to make that actual decision, and that's the best time to look at the forecast and use that understanding of uncertainty with the necessary awareness of the risk that it might not be, as specifically predicted. And we have that sort of range of options. So we said there's a 50% chance of rain or 70% chance of rain, and it's a percentage-based thing, and that helps people make an informed decision based on the sort of the risk levels that they've got in terms of the decisions that they're trying to make.
And I think the way you've started to communicate it differently, I've seen over my lifetime how weather forecasts are starting to communicate things differently based on the fact that most people don't get uncertainty. Yeah. There was that wonderfully historic moment that there's definitely not going to be a hurricane. How have you matured as an organisation in understanding how people hear your message rather than what you say?
I think it's really, really good observation, actually. I think you're right. I think the way that we communicate the weather forecast, and these days, people are much more able to take the data and not just wait for listening to the weather forecast at the end of the news, or perhaps looking at a visualization on an app, but actually taking that data into their decision-making tools, taking a data feed from the Met Office, and not just overlaying it on a map, but integrating that into some algorithms that can perhaps help them with decisions, which is great if there's a deterministic, as we call it, a deterministic forecast. But when there's a range of possibilities, I think understanding users, and I think that's one of the key things that we're doing, is understanding the user's environment. We recognize that not all users perhaps want the same information. Not all users have got the same level of technical capability or data savviness. And so we're working with that range of communities to understand their needs. And then from that, actually, we can work with you to understand the decisions that you're trying to make, and we can provide you with the data, and we can provide you with the information to support you in that. One of the things that's changed, I think, for me over the time that I've been at the Met Office is for example, we've got a Hadley Centre at the Met Office, the Hadley Centre for Climate Prediction. It used to be called the Hadley Centre for Climate Science, I think, and Climate Research. And if you look at it now, it's the Hadley Centre for Climate Science and Services. And the way that we communicate the outputs of that isn't just to fellow scientists with very specific language and citations. That's massively important to peer review the science research that we're doing, but actually expressing that in a way that means things to a wider audience, so that it is more understandable, that it is more engaging, it is more accessible. We talk about making our data more accessible, and to me that's a combination of two things. It's accessible in terms of our data can be integrated into your systems, but it's also accessible from a human perspective. Somebody's got to understand that as well. So looking at how we can storytell and create a narrative around what our data means. We often talk about impacts of our data. The weather warnings aren't just based on the likelihood of strong winds in London. They're balanced. There's a matrix of likelihood of the event happening and what's the impact of that event happening. So the impact of an event, the same event perhaps happening at 2:00 on a Saturday afternoon in the Highlands of Scotland versus that same event happening at 8:00 in the morning on a Monday in central London, the impact of that is quite different. So the probability of that event, flooding or strong winds or whatever, or freezing temperatures, would be the same, but the impact is different. And we're working now on sort of helping translate from what the weather will be, so the weather will be a certain thing, to what the weather will do. So it's starting to think about the so what factor. What does that mean for you in your decision-making process? And you could be a government, it could be an airline, it could be the military, it could be some sort of strategic planning about the sort of building infrastructure for Great British Energy, that's going to sustain for the next 50-something years. What's the decision that you're trying to make? What's the impact of weather and climate on that? And how can we help you? Not just provide you with a data feed, but give you the intelligence to work to go alongside that to help you make that better decision, as I said at the beginning, to stay safe and thrive.
And I think that's a really critical point there that a lot of other organisations could probably learn from you is understand your user needs, what decisions they need to make with the information you want to tell them, not just think about what you want to say, but what you want them to hear.
Yeah. Absolutely, and just say one of the part we just relaunched our Met Office corporate strategy earlier this year, and as well as that purpose of helping you make better decisions to stay safe and thrive, our sort of strategic vision is to provide the most trusted weather and climate intelligence in a radically changing world, because things are changing. Technology is changing, geopolitics is changing. The climate is changing. The frequency of more extreme events is increasing. The hottest temperatures, both globally and in the UK, are becoming more and more frequent that those records are in the news. So I think that radically changing world could be applied to different aspects of what the world is, but really working with our users to understand our users and making sure that we are user and customer driven, making sure that we're able to be agile and innovative, and really making sure that we've got that focus on purposeful data and the intelligence and the wisdom and the expertise that goes alongside it to help you make those decisions. So, for example, some of my colleagues at the Met Office are our civil contingency advisors, where we're working with Gold Command, with Category 2 responders, Cat 1, Cat 2 responders, to help them make decisions based on the sort of, in those cases, probably the more near real-term weather conditions, but absolutely working with those Gold Command organisations and COBRA in central government to help advise on the weather story, basically. It's about storytelling.
Brilliant. So we've covered uncertainty.
Yeah.
We've covered communication and storytelling. Let's move on to data sharing as well, because I presume you can't just predict what the weather might do just by looking at what's happening in the UK.
Yeah.
How does the Met Office go around sharing internationally with other organisations and also receiving from them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The weather doesn't recognise borders and boundaries. It has freedom of movement, and as I said, as the weather flows around the world, there's been a recognition that the weather data needs to flow around the world. So, as you said, predict the weather here in the UK. Sometimes we need to know what's going on if it's a beast from the east or an Arctic blast or dust coming up from the Sahara. But most of our weather comes from out west, westerly flow from across the Atlantic. And there's not many people live out in the Atlantic. So it's particularly difficult to be able to predict and observe what's going on out in the Atlantic until the advent of satellites and remote sensing of the weather. And recognising that, then there's an organisation called the World Meteorological Organization, which has got 193 member states and territories. And one of the great things that organisation has done over the last 50, 70 years or so is recognise the need for understanding the weather in different parts of the world. And so there's an international agreement, the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, data exchange policy. And it's a data exchange, and that word is really important to that community because it's the reciprocity. It's one country can't forecast the weather based on the weather that they observe in that country because it moves around. And one of the things that we really keen to do is recognise that if a nation perhaps shares its observations data, its records of the current weather with the rest of that community, not only will they get the observations from their neighbouring countries to help them with that, but also they will be able to get access to the forecasts that come from those other countries as well. And for some of the sort of the bigger countries that have got that supercomputer where we can predict the weather globally, because you need to predict the weather for the globe to be able to predict the weather for the UK, then being able to share that global forecast with some of the countries that perhaps don't have the infrastructure, less developed countries perhaps, where they're gathering observations and sharing them, and we can provide a forecast back to them to help their countries and their citizens stay safe and thrive. One of the key things with this World Meteorological Organization, which is a specialized agency of the United Nations, is to leave no country behind. So we absolutely are part of that community, being able to share the forecasts of the weather with countries and helping them make decisions on, whether the fishermen on Lake Victoria need to be aware of the conditions that might cause a storm out in Lake Victoria, and giving that information back to those communities and helping them communicate those forecasts to the people that are on the front line with those things. It's not just about sharing the weather forecast, as I said before. It's about communicating that weather forecast to the people that are particularly most impacted by that. And so that WMO program very much is looking at that reciprocity, that quid pro quo of data exchange rather than just data sharing.
And I think that quid pro quo is probably something other organisations can learn from as well. There's a lot of burden in supplying data for other people when you don't necessarily see the value, but circling back the value back to those supplying, and you being both supplier and receiver, I suppose,
Absolutely.
is critical in that relationship.
We're a consumer and a producer of data, and I think that's really important. I was at an event last week where I was using this as an example of how organisations can share data with each other on a quid pro quo basis. What's in it for me?
Yeah.
One of there's a lot of data challenges that we've got at the Met Office. The weather keeps moving, and our data has a very short shelf life. The temperature changes, the rain showers move, all of those things. But data protection is probably one of the lesser things that we need to necessarily be concerned about, because our data isn't about necessarily the citizen. So some of the concerns that we've got about sharing data between organisations is perhaps less of a concern for us. I think, as I said, the challenge for us is perhaps looking at how we share our data within the UK, for example, with organisations that don't speak meteorology, that don't have PhDs in climate science. But how can we communicate that to them to say, actually, you're interested in this particular facet of the weather. You don't care where the jet stream is. We could tell you. But we know that you don't need that information.
So that's focusing very much on user need then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great example of that is the shipping forecast. Everybody's heard of the shipping forecast, certainly in the UK. And it interrupts the cricket maybe, or you sort of fall to sleep sort of as those mellow tones are coming across the airwaves. If you listen to it, we really understand who the users of this data are, what the shipping forecast is for. It doesn't mention temperature. We've got temperature in all of those areas around the UK sort of waters, but we don't share it because in that narrow window of opportunity, as was, I mean, a lot of it is through an API, can be accessed through an API these days as well. But their decision making isn't concerned about temperature. It's interested in pressure levels. It's interested in visibility. It's interested in wind strength. All of those things are massively important, and sea state. All of those things are massively important, but not temperature. We could provide them with temperature, but it's like, so what? We don't make our decision based on that. By understanding our users, we can tailor the data and the services that we provide them to meet their needs.
That's really interesting. And I listened to the shipping forecast just before farming today when I'm driving to the train station, so I can totally empathise with that. One thing I did want to ask you is, what sort of key skills does it take to be a data leader in what is primarily a data organisation?
I think, it's a tricky one for me because I've worked at the Met Office over 30 years. And so I guess by process of osmosis, I sort of know what the Met Office does, and I've done enough jobs at the Met Office to have a good sense of what the organisation does. But I think that's really important, to be a data leader, to understand the purpose of the Met Office, how we use data, how we consume data, how we generate data. But at the same time, I think, that idea of understanding, certainly for me in terms of what I'm doing now, sort of with an external engagement focus, is understanding, as I said, understanding our stakeholders, having a strategic view of what the Met Office is and does. There's lots of things we could do, but what is it that we're prioritising? And I think within the organisation, having a good understanding of the challenges of data management. It's a bit dull, but metadata is so important to what we do. Being able to discover and describe what we do for our own staff, to sometimes, under the covers. And I think perhaps one of the challenges of data sharing across government and between organisations is the more data that you share, perhaps you're exposing the way that you have managed and governed it within your organisation. So there's a big focus on unpicking the sort of the spaghetti of the way that we organically have grown our systems and services within the Met Office to say, all right, data governance can help us with this. Metadata can help us with this. If we just bought something off the shelf, we just transfer the same problem into a nice shiny package. But if we can use metadata to really help us with simplifying our data management, focusing on our data governance, then I think that is a really big thing for us at the Met Office in terms of leading an organisation that consumes petabytes of data every day.
Brilliant. Going to take us in a slightly different direction now. So who names the storms and how much influence have you got? Because I'd love to see Hurricane Neil come up this winter.
There might have been one, Neil. You do. You name it. So every year we ask the public, so can you put some nominations in for what you think storm names should be? Yeah. And if you can provide us a little story behind that. So it's usually about the end of August that we announce this year's for the coming winter season, which runs through, I think, from September through to August. I think that's the sort of the year so A is the first one. And it rarely gets beyond the middle of the alphabet, I think.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know,
I'll change my name.
I know.
Yeah,
but it's the public. But we offer it out to the public, and we get thousands of people putting suggestions in, and we do it. We've combined forces with Met Éireann, the Irish Met Service, and KNMI, the Dutch Met Service. And I think it's those three organisations that share the same naming approach. Excellent. So it could be that the storm doesn't necessarily affect the UK, but if it affects Ireland or the Netherlands, then we add it to our list.
Excellent. So not much chance of having Storm Boaty McBoatface then in the near future.
No, Storm Simon's a long way down the list.
Excellent. So I'm going to bang a couple of quick fire questions into you now, Simon, as we sort of come towards the end of our time together. So what is the most unusual thing that you've done in your time at the Met Office?
I've done lots of different things. I've done lots of different jobs at the Met Office. I've graffitied the floor in the Met Office. We run a STEM programme, and so we get students in who are maybe 12, 13 years old, and they camp out overnight in our conference room. So we have these pop-up tents in our conference rooms. And one of the things that we do as part of this STEM programme is look at how before computers, how were forecasts generated. And so we chalk on the floor. We've got this big slate floor in the Met Office, and we chalk on the floor and get people standing in different parts of this grid and say, right, okay, you calculate that temperature. You hand it over as if the wind's blown this piece of paper to the next one. They take the temperature that's coming their way and they do something with it. And so we've chalked all over the floor with these 12 and 13-year-olds. And it's like, you first do it and you're like, should I be doing this? So we chalked all over the floor. One of the first jobs I did in my career was help calibrate satellite instruments. And so we ran we tried to simulate space in a thermal vacuum chamber in Farnborough. And so I've worked through the night calibrating satellite instruments. And then the pinnacle of that was to fly out to the States and be the Met Office representative when the satellite was launched, and they do the post-launch calibration. And this satellite orbits around the Earth. And so you get like a 10-minute window as it's passing overhead from where you can live communicate with this thing. And they say, right, okay, analyze this data. Is it working? If it's not, we need to shut it down. You've got 10 minutes to do that calculation. And otherwise you've got to wait another 100 minutes before it goes over the poles and back around again. And so to be able to then say, yeah, I think everything's fine. Let's go with it for another orbit. It's quite a stressful thing when everybody's looking at you. Met Office, are you happy that we keep your instrument running? Yes.
Sounds brilliant, that. And I know you do a lot of talks and panel sessions as well, Simon. So what's the most unusual or obscure or just plain odd question that someone's ever asked you? Not any of my questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are some questions from you, Neil, I've seen in the past. There's the obvious question is, will it be a white Christmas? Recently, I was asked, has it ever rained cats and dogs? Which is just which is a hilarious question. Of course, it has rained cats and dogs, because I'm sure you, like I, have stepped in a poodle.
Oh, dear. You were waiting for that one, weren't you? So brilliant. So will it be a white Christmas this year?
Too early to tell. I could barely tell you what it's going to be like. I should have checked before I came in.
You should, because you didn't know I was going to say this.
Yeah. To be fair, I think there is high pressure, so the mornings are cold, as we talked about earlier, but it's relatively dry, unlike it was at the start of September. Yeah. So hopefully, certainly for the next few days, dry, autumnal, misty mornings, but warming up in the afternoon.
And so it's fair to say that you also have a very high-pressured job as well, then.
A high-pressured job,
there you go.
Good.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Simon, for sharing some of your stories and insights. And it's incredible to hear about some of the challenges that you've faced, the decisions that have shaped your journey. I particularly like the satellites. I didn't realise you'd done that. So that's one to talk over a pint later as well. We like to end each episode of the esynergy podcast with a simple but powerful question here. So in one sentence, Simon, what do you think is one piece of advice that you wish every business leader would understand sooner?
I think for me, understanding that data is just one facet of a decision-making process. It's the data and the expertise in how to use it, and maybe how not to use it, that is a really valuable lesson.
I think that's really important. Thank you very much. Simon McLellan, Head of Data Engagement at the UK Met Office, the weather people, not the police force. I've been Neil McIvor, and this has been your eSynergy podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.